Hello and welcome to February's Breaking Barriers LinkedIn Live. Really great to have you with us. I'm Rachel Schofield and I'm delighted to be joined by two colleagues today. I'm welcoming Dr. Priscila Pereira, Director of Research and Innovation at Shape Talent. Nice wave from you there, Priscila, thank you. And Sharon Peake, our founder and CEO. Hi there, Sharon, thanks very much. I feel like I should kind of put out a chorus for what day is it nearly? It's International Women's Day coming up, isn't it, on the 8th of March. And in all seriousness, we wanted for our Breaking Barriers LinkedIn Live today to give 30 minutes or so to taking a really clear-eyed look at where does gender equity stand in 2026 with International Women's Day just around the corner. What progress is now required from HR leaders? We love to do this LinkedIn Live. We invite heads of people, HR leaders, anyone who takes an interest in gender equity and the practicalities of that within your organization. So today we're going to be looking at where gender equity stands across the EU and the UK. What has genuinely moved forward? Where has progress stalled? And what, crucially, do organizations need to be paying attention to? What do they need to be doing next? Tell us in the chat. It'd be really nice to know, actually, what are you planning for International Women's Day? Where are you spending International Women's Day? Sharon, where are you spending International Women's Day?
I'm going to be spending it at home with my daughter.
Lovely. Yeah, fantastic. And Priscilla, do you have any particular plans, any event you're going to, anything you particularly like to read up on?
No, the same thing, just at home with Sophia, my daughter, and we usually talk about it. So that's quite nice. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, it'll be a quieter Sunday, International Women's Day, but fantastic. We'd love to know in the comments what your plans are, not necessarily for the day itself. It might be that you're going to something in the week coming up to it or the week afterwards. But let's then take a look. We're going to start by looking backwards. What's been happening in this world? Where have we got to globally? What are we seeing? And I should say, actually, in the course of today's LinkedIn Live, there'll be a chance for questions, hopefully at the end. So if something strikes you, you want to know more, you're curious, do use the chat, do drop in your questions. We'll keep an eye on that and hopefully have some time at the end. If not, we absolutely get to those later on. And also worth saying that it's going to be a really rich data points coming up for us in today's LinkedIn Live. So we will later on be dropping all the interesting links to data and stats and surveys that we mentioned in the chat. So if it's something that really interests you and you want to dig a bit deeper, look out for that a little bit nearer the end. But Sharon, let me come to you first of all, because we're going to spend some time with you first of all, looking at where we've got to. So before we look ahead, maybe you can help us understand the current state of play. What's been happening recently with gender equity, particularly in the UK and the EU?
Fabulous. Thank you, Rachel. And of course, it is the perfect time to be looking at this with a week to go to International Women's Day. So let me start actually by zooming out and looking globally. Then I'll talk about the UK and the EU. So if we look at the global picture when it comes to gender equality, probably one of the best known benchmarks of this is the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report. They do this every year. They publish a ranking of all countries around the world, 180 odd countries around the world. So under this measure, it looks at health outcomes, education outcomes, political representation, and economic participation. And it gives a sense of how much of a gap there is, a gender gap. Now, the last report to come out in 2025 frustratingly showed that the gender gap is 68% closed. So there's still a huge way to go before we reach full parity. Women hold 28.8% of leadership positions worldwide, so not even a third, somewhere between a quarter and a third of leadership positions around the world. So again, still a long way to go. And the World Economic Forum do a prediction of how long it's going to take to achieve gender parity in terms of time. And depressingly, it's still 123 years away. So down from 135 the year before, so technically improving, but actually a long, long way off. And in fact, it's worse than pre-COVID. So we have certainly regressed since COVID. But to be 123 years off gender equality is incredibly frustrating. If you think about that in business terms, no business would accept a a 100+ year transformation plan, right? No one would accept, no CEO would accept, you know, a digital transformation or a profit transformation or a sustainability transformation that was going to take more than 5 generations. They, you know, the timelines are always so much shorter in businesses. So to be 123 years away globally feels incredibly painful. So that's where we are globally. In terms of the UK, there is some positive news in the UK. So in the same ranking, the UK has jumped from 14th place globally to 4th place globally in the world. And that's largely being driven by increased political representation. So in the 2024 election, there were the most women ever elected to the House of Commons, and we now have the most gender balanced cabinet in UK history. So that score has gone up enormously, which is a real achievement. Let's not pretend it's not a huge achievement, but it's worth noting that it hasn't really shifted anything in terms of the workplace at this point. So progress is real, but it's narrow. And then to your other question, the EU. So what's happening at an EU level? Well, it's a little bit more textured because, of course, you've got great variation across countries in the EU. The European Institute for Gender Equality, the EIGE, do an index every year, the Gender Equality Index, and they put the EU average score at 63 out of 100 for gender equality. So not a great score. It's gone down actually in the last year. It was 71 the year before. So in the EU, it's going backwards. But of course, you've got this huge variation from Sweden, their score is in the 70s, through to other countries that are below 50. So there's a real spread of progress across the EU. And one of the key drivers of that gap is pay, actually. So women earn around 77% of men's annual earnings across the EU, which is kind of getting better. It's risen 8 percentage points in 10 years, but you can see it's a slow pace of change. The EIGE describe it as women effectively working this ghost quarter of a year for free. So basically you're working 3 months of the year for free compared to what a man is earning. And the other thing to note in the EU, women in couples earn on average 30% less than their male partners. So, you know, according to the EIGE, if you look just at the EU, we're at least 50 years away from gender equality. So technically we're progressing, but it's such a glacial pace that it doesn't feel like there's been much progress.
So if you had to summarize in one sentence how the global picture is looking?
If I had to summarize the global picture in one sentence, I would say that we have normalized slow progress. Frustratingly, as a society, as organizations, we are not operating with the urgency that we need to. And this is a real risk for HR leaders, actually, because if the external world is moving so slowly and incrementally on this topic, but your stakeholder expectations are much pacier. If the boards, the investors, your employees, your customers are expecting much quicker action, then actually the pressure is only going to increase on you. And so the question isn't whether this matters, it's whether you're ahead of it or whether you're behind it.
Yeah, thank you. I should say, by the way, I'm going to be coming to Priscila later. Priscila's sitting very patiently because what we want to do is Sharon's going to take us kind of up to where we are now and bring us into the present. And then we'll be looking forward with Priscila, just in case anyone thinks, when's Priscila going to speak? But Sharon, let me stay with you because I know you've looked at this a lot. And I want to bring it back specifically to leadership. So what does the data tell us about women's representation in the decision-making roles, essentially?
Yeah, well, the data is really interesting, and we've got some brand new UK data just out this week, the FTSE Women Leaders Review, which is a review that's done every year on the top 350 publicly listed companies and the top 50 privately held companies. So that shows that women hold 43% of those FTSE 350 board positions. 43% is huge, and 36% of executive roles overall, so about a third of executive roles. So these are real gains, and especially if you look back to, I remember when this reporting first started 15 years ago in 2011, women held 9.5% of board roles. So to go from 9.5 to 43% in 15 years is extraordinary. It's really positive. But There is a disconnect. So across the entire FTSE 350, there are just 21 female CEOs, 21 out of 350 organisations. So that's 6%. And this pattern is very similar across the EU. Women make up between 6 and 8% of CEOs across the EU, and also about a third of executive and senior management roles. So representation has increased over the last decade, but it has regressed since COVID. COVID really set back gender equality. So we're seeing progress at the more visible level, the board level, which is where there's regulatory pressure, where there's public scrutiny, but we're seeing real stagnation where power actually sits, which is in the executive ranks.
Yeah, dive into that with me a little bit more, because we've got then, it's odd, that strong progress at board level, but far less movement at the exec level. So are we able to unpick what's going on structurally, culturally?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on at once here. So first, and I'd be remiss not to mention this, of course, the broader geopolitical context. So in parts of the US, where we've seen some real anti-DEI rhetoric coming out in the last year, we're seeing quite an active erosion of women's rights and of DEI commitments, EDI commitments. So when you've got effectively the world's biggest economy signalling that kind of this is optional or this is not important, it kind of sets a tone for organizations around the world, particularly multinational organizations. So we've seen the impact of that for sure. But closer to home, there are several other issues going on here. So firstly, what I would call performative progress. So, boards get gender balance because they're visible. There's a spotlight on them, there's reporting on them, but the executive pipeline kind of flies under the radar a little bit, and that's where the real gaps still persist, and that's where we're stagnating. So kind of my second point is, even where we have an increase in the feeder pools to these senior leadership roles, the conversion rate is really weak. So women are entering leadership, they're just not progressing to the very top roles. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of those is the glass cliff pattern that we see, where women are disproportionately more likely than men to be appointed to high risk roles. So roles that exist, leadership roles during a crisis, for example, or a turnaround, where the risk of failure is really high. So there's not that many roles offered to women, but often they are disproportionately the risky roles. So that puts other women off for a start, and it also has this higher rate of failure. And then the other point I think that's feeding into this is that women are being channeled away from the commercial and operational roles that are the feeder roles to the most senior jobs. So kind of the profit and loss holding roles, which are generally a feeder role to CEO roles, women are disproportionately represented in other functions.
Yeah, really interesting. Powerful picture there of the current state. But if we just think for a moment before we start looking forwards, laws and regulations, what are some of the recent changes in the last couple of years that leaders should be aware of?
Yeah, there's a couple I would highlight. In the UK, and this one has been in place for a little while now, the Worker Protection Act. So that came in end of 2024, which put a new proactive duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment. So not just respond to it if it happens, but to actively prevent it. Which is really powerful, really important, particularly given 3 in 5 women in the workplace report having experienced harassment at work. So really important piece of legislation that made a shift from the reactive to proactive prevention a requirement. There is, of course, more coming, which Priscilla is going to talk about with the Employment Rights Act in the UK. But the other piece of legislation that's come in recently, which I think is really important and really helpful for gender equality, is in the EU, we've had the Pay Transparency Directive. Now, this is coming in soon, so it needs to be embedded into local law by June this year. And this also isn't just about reporting, but this is actually really shifting the burden of proof onto organisations for ensuring pay equity. So it will soon be on employers, not employees, to be able to explain and to be able to justify pay differences in the event of a complaint around pay. So you need to be able to evidence why pay decisions were made and to demonstrate consistency. You need a defendable process. And also employees and their trade unions are going to be able to request some data. So they're going to be able to request average pay levels at an aggregate level. And if there is an unjustifiable gap of more than 5% in pay, and if it isn't resolved within 6 months, it can trigger a joint pay assessment, which is likely to be a pretty onerous process for organisations. So the long-term stakes of this are really quite high. If you look at what happens when you have pay gaps, the gender pay gap then leads to a pension gap later down the track. So the less you're earning now, obviously the less pension you get. So the pension pay gap sits at around 26% in the EU, which is kind of the cumulative effect of pay gaps, career breaks, working part-time. So any pay equity issues now become pension equity issues later. So having this kind of legislation is really helpful.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sharon. That's fantastic. And really given us a sense of what's been happening, what the data is showing, what are some of the legal and legislative changes that have come about and where we've got to. And I want to now shift to look ahead. And let me bring you in here, Priscilla, because for organisations who are thinking, what next? Where do we go in 2026 and beyond? I know you've got some fantastic kind of pointers for people. Let's stay with that legal framework, the regulatory shifts that have been happening. What's coming down the line now that leaders and organisations need to be prepping for?
Right. So in the UK, I think that there is a big shift, providing there is no major political shift really in the next few years. But we are seeing phased employment law changes across 26 and 27 under the Employment Rights Act 2025. Employment laws are important because they increase protection against prejudice and unfair treatment. So for marginalized groups, this is broadly positive news. Now, if I bring that to a gender point of view, there are several points that it's interesting about this new act. But the first one is about protection around vulnerable employment, like 0 hours, agency, casual workers, and women are more likely to be in this type of employment. For example, Trades Union Congress reported in 2025 that 11.7% of workers are engaged in this type of employment, with 7.1 of them being women compared to 6.5 of them. So improvements around last-minute cancellation of shifts, short notice for shifts and having a penalty if you cannot turn up to work, certainty around the amount of hours that you are going to have, they're all very important. Another point is that there will be the cap on unfair dismissal will be removed. And this is significant because this might reduce the risks organizations that are willing to take, because now you no longer have a price tag to the risk. And I remember when I was an in-house practitioner, it's a big deal. If you don't know the price, if you take that risk and something goes wrong, I think that will force organizations to do the right thing. Then from a maternity and pregnancy point of view, there is a post-return safeguard that was included. So that means stronger protections against dismissal for 6 months for people that they're returning from maternity. From a paternity and parental leave entitlement, you'll be entitled from day one. So you don't need to wait for the long qualifying periods anymore. Then you have something around the flexible working and caregiving as well. Although flexible working has been improving anyway, even in terms of the qualifying period that you request to work flexibly, one of the things that's very interesting now is that under the Act, we are moving closer to make flexible working a default right. So at Shape Talent, we always say, make flexible working the normal. And that's kind of what hopefully is going to be happening. So it's not just about following the right process and procedure to request. I think now the reason for refusing a request will be as important as following the right procedure. Of course, things like that, we need to wait for the law to be developed with casework, but you can see that shift happening in the wording, which is very important. Then, as Sharon mentioned, sexual harassment is another big point here. And there are a few important movements here and improvements. So employers are liable for third-party harassment now. NEDAs can no longer be used to silence victims, and sexual harassment is now listed as a wrongdoing that triggers whistleblowing protections. Because many employees rely on whistleblowing routes because they don't fully trust internal grievance processes or they fear retaliation. So whistleblowing might enable more people coming forward. And when organizations they have this greater visibility of issues, it becomes much harder not to take all the required steps to prevent harassment. And prevention now is a key point. So if you have got data that thinks they're happening and you're not preventing, then you're going to be in trouble. The next point is about the gender pay gap, and that's something that I'm very excited. And I was talking to someone from Shape Talent actually internally, and they said something that's very interesting, because now we're not just going the UK to report the pay gap. We need to have actual plans, and they need to be defendable. And many organizations, they don't even know how to write a gender action plan to close their gender pay gap. And with the new act as well, the plans, they must include menopause support. So that is going to be super, super interesting as well to see. And
Yeah.
lastly, from a UK point of view, I think that the Employment Tribunal claims deadlines that they have been extended from 3 to 6 months. I think that's more realistic, because particularly discrimination, harassment cases, they tended to be very emotionally complex, and individuals might need time even to recognize that the incident was unlawful, and they need to exhaust internal process. So the 3 months actually was never the right amount of time. So I think that 6 months is more realistic now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Priscilla. That's a really great overview of some of the key things that are coming through. Sharon was also talking about EU pay transparency, this deadline of June later this year to be fully adopted into national law. So let's think about some of the practicalities around this. If organizations, employers are thinking about prepping for that, and maybe they've got employees across multiple countries, what are they going to need to be doing and thinking about?
I think that particularly if you're a EU organization, or if you have got operations within the EU, most people, they think that pay transparency is about reporting. And as Sharon mentioned, that's not. So you will need to rethink things like your job design, have consistent role evaluation, pay governance, and particularly make sure that managers, they are capable to execute proper pay policies, because the directive, as Sharon mentioned, shifting the burden towards organization approve. So if you don't have these things in place, how can you prove that you're doing the right thing?
Yeah. Anything else in this space, particularly around kind of legislative things?
Yes, and we're all waiting. We're all excited to wait the new EU gender equality strategy. So the last one came to an end, as Sharon mentioned, and the European Commission is preparing the new strategy to continue the efforts to achieve gender equality across the EU. The consultation finished in August 2025, and one of the items was around improving mechanisms for enforcement, monitoring, and compliance. This means more resources allocated for audits, more funding, more consequences and penalties in regulations. So reporting is not going to be just performative, and hopefully this is going to address some of the issues that Sharon mentioned at the beginning, that it feels like we normalized this low progress. I think that you can see a shift in terms of moving towards something that's more urgent, and we need to be accountable. So hopefully that we are entering a new phase of gender equity.
Yeah. In a minute, I'm going to lean into just some of the practical things that organizations should then be doing for our last few minutes. But before I do that, I can't not ask you about AI, the impact of AI, how leaders should be thinking about that going forwards in 2026 and beyond, particularly in the context of gender equity.
Yes, that's such a good point. And we're all learning, and we kind of at Shape Talent really have taken a position that we want to learn more and more about this. But the importance about AI is because AI can either scale fairness or can scale biases. And UNESCO has recently flagged evidence of regressive gender stereotypes in generative AI outputs. But the interesting thing is the action here is super practical. You need to audit your AI outputs, particularly in recruitment, performance, and promotion, and ensure that there is bias testing and meaningful human oversight. So, and we have seen evidence as well that as long as you're using independent tools, you can get AI to monitor and audit AI and to audit AI, and I think that is much easier to remove biases from intelligence systems than actually from people. So if you get this governance right in terms of AI, I think that there is a massive opportunity for us here.
Okay, right. That was one practical step around AI. The bigger picture, what organizations should be doing now, gender equity in 2026 and beyond. What would you start with? What should organizations really be thinking to get themselves ready? Because I guess readiness is one of the key words here.
Yes, exactly. I would say exactly that. It is, we need to frame around readiness, because the next step of gender is going to be less forgiving. So over the next 2 years, organizations will face sharper expectations through pay transparency, employment law reform, and AI governance. So things like reporting, compliance, but from a preventative point of view, and benchmarking will only intensify. So a good practical way of thinking about self-assessing your readiness around 3 areas. So the first one is around, do our core systems, things like job design, performance, progression, pay, generally work for people with different life patterns? Or are they still built around the ideal worker model? So from very practical point of view, are promotion criteria tied to visibility and presentism rather than measurable outcomes? Are part-timers and flexible workers progressing at the same rate of full-time peers, for example? So that is one self-assessment that you need to do. Another one would be something around, can we clearly explain and defend 2 things? Our decisions and our plans, because remember, the regulations will expect you to have defendable plans now in place. So under EU pay transparency rules, for example, as we said, the burden shifts to the organization. So if you're asked the question, can you answer and can you defend your answer? So things like, can you evidence why someone was hired on a higher salary? Or are performance ratings calibrated and documented, or largely subjective? Or do you have a clear and defendable plan to close your gender pay gap? So that's the second, I would say, readiness, self-assessment. And the third and last one is around AI. So you need to be able to ask yourself and answer, where are we using intelligent systems? And are we auditing them for biases? And do we have meaningful human oversight? So questions like, are we actively checking if our recruitment software is screening out some patterns like career breaks? Or who is responsible for, or who is reviewing our AI outputs to check for gender biases and patterns? It does feel that there is a lot to do, and if you're an organization that you have not been on top of the basics, you might find that it's time to step up very quickly. But you don't need to do everything at once. I think that you need to go back and understand your biggest exposures and focus on them.
Yeah, I really like the way you framed that as kind of questions for organizations, employers to be asking themselves. We've only got a couple more minutes left, which is the time just flies by. But just a final question then, Priscilla. If people are thinking about, where is our biggest exposure? Where do we need to be focusing our energy? This feels a bit overwhelming. What could people be doing?
Okay, let's think that as a 3 steps kind of approach. So the first one, you need to identify where outcomes are weakest. Yeah, so is that to do with pay gaps at senior levels? Is lower career progression for returners? Is that high attrition among women mid-career? And focus on them. Launching broad inclusion culture initiatives with no targets is not going to be the right thing to do right now, because you need to defend your plans. And that moves to the second point. You need to move from visibility to accountability. The expectation now is not just about publishing data or setting aspirational targets. It's about how the plan is defendable. And it will need things like cascading strategies, how progress is measured, how leaders are held responsible for delivery. So a question is, how are you going to link execution of these plans to performance management, for example? And the last one, which I think that's super important, is always support your line managers, because most inequity isn't driven by bad intent. It's embedded in the system. The systems, they are expressed through day-to-day decisions of line managers. So if line managers, they don't understand how to apply pay bands consistently, how to assess flexible workers fairly, how bias shows up in performance conversations, for example, the risk is they will be everywhere and it will be very difficult to mitigate them.
Yeah. Priscila, fantastic. Thank you so much, both to Priscila Pereira and Sharon Peake, for taking us through where we've got to and what happens next. I think it's really fair to say that there's a clear message here. Gender equity hasn't stalled, but it has become more demanding. Legislation keeps progressing. And so the organisations, I guess, that move forward are going to be those ones that are really focusing on outcomes, sorting out strong systems, preparing early for these things that are coming down the line. If you want to learn more about this, we'll be dropping into the chat all of the links to the data and some of the kind of resources that Priscila and Sharon have mentioned. There they are, as if by magic, they appear, because we know that this is a complex area and people get very interested. If you would like a conversation with Sharon or with Priscila, if you'd like to hear more about how we as Shape Talent can support you, then do connect on LinkedIn, go to our website, do connect and follow up with us. We also have, if you're thinking, gosh, where do I even start? A really great place to start is with our 3 barriers white paper. We're on to the 3rd edition of that. And again, on our website, you can get more insights through that paper on the why women are underrepresented in leadership. If you're really thinking, I want to strip this right back, that's a fantastic resource for you. Wherever you are spending International Women's Day, Matthew is hosting an internal panel on the power of brands to support women's sport. Fantastic. So whatever you are doing, either on Sunday or around that time, we wish you a really happy International Women's Day. And we hope to see you next month. That will be on the 26th of March at 10 o'clock. So a morning session. I'll be back with Sharon. And this is an intriguing one. Sharon will be talking to us about some untraditional, really practical strategies to accelerate talent in your organisation. We hope to see you then. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Priscila. Great to see you. Cheerio. Bye-bye.